Hello and thank you for joining me. My name is Frederick Dunn and today we're doing some practical testing. Answering a couple of questions, the first being at what temperature do honeybees begin to forage? You're watching a time-lapse sequence here. And look, it's 41 degrees, going up to 45 degrees, the sun is rising, and we have wasps at the feeders. What's in the bottles? ProSweet, full strength. Now we're up to 50 degrees, we have honeybees everywhere. And then they're piling up, and it's no big surprise that as the temperatures rise, 55 degrees now, the bees are all over these resources. Now this is an established open feeding spot, so we can make these observations, which means scouts head out early and they check the spots first where they found resources in the past. So no big surprise as we hit 60 degrees here. And by the way, this was shot in the beginning of November, first week of November actually. So now you can see the syrup coming down pretty fast. This sequence covers an entire day. And so we satisfy a couple of things. One, if you're going to put out syrup for your bees, open feeding, and this is for primarily backyard beekeepers because this is small scale stuff. You could put your feed inside your house. Liquid feed is what we're talking about now, but the foraging temperature is the same whether they're going for pollen substitute or a liquid feed like this, which is the equivalent of actual honey, even though it is just ProSweet, but it is that consistency, the same thickness, and the bees can take it back and use it one-to-one and start to store it for the weak colonies that need to build up more resources going into winter. So the time-lapse sequence takes the full day. So the moral of the story here is don't put it out too early because while it's colder, things like wasps and hornets will have access to the syrup before the bees begin their foraging. So the other thing is you might question the accuracy of the thermometer that's stuck on the left side there on that feeder. And we did use a calibrated thermometer later to validate the temperatures that the bees forage. And keep in mind too that bees are very efficient when they're foraging. So the first thing that goes out every day would be the scouts. Scout bees go out. The first places that they check are places where resources were found in the past. That's why if we're doing a study like this, we keep the feed source location consistent. Because I want to see them come and notice they take left and right at the same time. And there's a reason why we're doing this ahead of time, is because when we put in different temperature liquid resources for the bees, we want to see and make sure that it didn't matter whether it was on the left side or the right side. So if anything, we're noticing that on the left, they're taking it quicker. On the right, a little bit slower maybe, but as the day comes to a close, you'll see that the temperatures are dropping. See the thermometer? We're at 60 now. We're going to go down into the 50s again. And of course, the sun is going to begin to set. The temperatures are going to drop, and the foragers will return back to the hives. There's another thing that we're going to cover here, and that is how you sometimes put your foragers at risk if the temperature of the syrup you're putting out is too cold. And that is that at the end of the day, they may not make it back before it gets cold and grounds them overnight. So now we're already down to wasps, a couple of flies, and as the sun sets, temperatures continue to drop. We're at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're at night now, and the last thing to show up, of course, will be moths. So we've got moths and other nocturnal insects, but let's continue our examination here. Now we're at 48.9 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is a traceable thermometer. It is calibrated and is accurate. So we've got bees already out foraging, but what did they come to? A source that they had in the past that they knew provided resources. So the scouts came out, validated that the resource was there, went back, did their waggle dances, and of course the foragers all returned. So now we have a difference. On the right, we have cold syrup that was left out overnight, and there was an air pocket in it. So as the morning arrived and the air pocket expanded, it pushed syrup into the feeding base. So on the left here, this syrup is actually in the 60s. Bees are flying, and I want you to notice that underneath, there's no bees clinging. This syrup is much colder. It was left out overnight, just like you would when open feeding. So if you notice, the bees are getting stuck in it. The syrup is equal in both bottles as far as the consistency, full strength ProSweet. The bees are drinking it, but after they drink it, they're having problems flying away. Now we've got a thermal scan. So if we look at the full range, we're going anywhere from 68 degrees at the high point there. This syrup is at 46.6, 49, and so on, and that's because it was left out overnight, as most people would leave their open feeding resources out overnight. And the one on the left here is at 63, 64 degrees, and the body temperature of the bees that are feeding on it goes up into the 80s. So the thorax of a honeybee, when it's flying, the muscles are located in the thorax. They're generally in the high 70s, mid 80s, so that they can have the ability to fly away. So when we're feeding them syrup, as noticed here on the right, that is too cold, below 50. Notice that the temperature of the bees, their thorax is also colder. That's why they get grounded by the syrup. Some of these bees have temperatures up into the 80s, and remember they warm themselves up. They use carbohydrates as a calorie source, and that's what the syrup really is for anyway. And they can warm up and fly away. That's why they're not falling on the ground underneath that warmer liquid syrup. Full range again, you can see that it drops down even into the 30s for some of the coldest stuff, which is back in the distance here. And the high temperature range, 66.4, and that's ambient temperature around the areas here. So the background, 53, 54, and the bees are foraging. So now we get a clearer view. On the right, remember, it was left out overnight, and on the left we brought that out in the morning so that it would be in the 60s. So you can boost your bees. The temperature of some of this syrup actually drops into the 40s, and when the bees take that into their honey crop, what some people call the honey stomach, chills the bee and makes it sit around, so it has to warm up that syrup, warm up their flight muscles before they can fly off again. So on the left we see that they're taking in the syrup just as fast as it can come out of the bottle. The configurations are identical, the only difference being the one on the left was warmed and the one on the right was left at the temperatures that it was exposed to overnight. So syrup, especially 2-to-1 syrup or honey consistency syrup, holds the cold for a long time. It also holds the warmth for a long time, but warm syrup is going to make your bees more efficient foragers because they don't have to warm it before they can fly away. The syrup on the right chills the bees, and they go after it equally, but the ones on the right that take in the cold syrup are going to end up landing on the ground, clinging to grass blades, sitting on the leaves, clinging to the post that supports it, and then spending a lot of time there as they warm up, clean themselves up, because also the syrup that's colder is much more viscous, so it sticks to their body parts. I'm going to give you a close-up look, and you're going to see that these bees, again on the left, they're taking the syrup as quick as it can come out. And remember, this was not left out overnight, it was taken inside, so it was brought out in the 60s. So if you are a backyard beekeeper and you're thinking about open feeding, knowing when your honeybees are going to show up at your feeding station is going to be helpful, because you can wait and put your syrup out after they start their meaningful forage temperatures. The other thing is you're going to stop feeding wasps and hornets and things that can fly colder. The other thing that this video will answer is that for those of you who like to put the syrup out, just leave it until they use it all up, whether it's 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. Sugar syrup makes a little difference. This, again, as I said before, is Pro Sweet. This is late in the year. It has the consistency of actual honey, and it's beneficial to your bees to help them build up if they haven't found forage late in the year, and they don't have to dehydrate it down much. The other thing is most of it will be consumed by foragers and not put into storage and sealed up. You don't do this with honey supers on either. But look at all the bees below this feeder that are clinging to the grass blades. They've got syrup on their feet, syrup spattered on their bodies, and they've been chilled by the syrup that they're taking in. So this presents a challenge for the bees. Could that be bad for them? Other than wasting the energy, other than reducing efficiency, and keeping them from flying back at more frequent intervals to the hive that they've departed from, it actually can put them in jeopardy. For example, this time of year, often a storm might come in, the weather can change, the temperature can drop. The bees that are feeding on warmer syrup will be able to fly back immediately and seek shelter inside their beehive. For the bees that drank the colder syrup that was below 50 degrees Fahrenheit in particular, they're grounded, and if the temperatures drop, they hunker down in place and they go into a state of torpor right where they are, and they try to survive the storm, or in some cases they try to survive overnight, stuck in place because they drank cold syrup. So this also comes into play if you're putting a container of syrup, inverted jars, things like that, on top of your beehives in wintertime, which we don't recommend any liquids in winter. I recommend that you shift to a fondant solid feed for your emergency backups, because if there's liquid syrup above your hive in your feeder shim or in a spare hive box, for example, it's going to be cold just like this, and then what the bees do is they cluster under it right up at the feeding spout. Hopefully it limits the amount of feed that can go into the hive, but two things can happen. One, they don't get a very efficient use of the syrup because they have to warm it before they consume it. Number two, if there's an air gap up in there, notice how deep the syrup is in this feeding trough. That's because the air gap expanded when the warm air arrived and pushed more syrup out into it. Likewise, inside a hive, that expansion of the air gap inside your feeding container would push syrup down into the hive onto your brood frames potentially. Most people put those feeders in the center, which is right where the cluster is, and you would be pushing out cold syrup onto the cluster of the bees down below, and they would have to warm it and clean one another up before they could make use of it. And it's just not very efficient to put cold syrup in your beehive. So there again, what's the temperature parameter? So anything below 51 degrees Fahrenheit seems to have this negative impact on the bees. And once it warms up later, and the bees are capable of flying and the flight muscles don't have to be warmed after they've taken on board cold syrup, then they're back in service. But they are at risk of being trapped out here overnight. They are vulnerable to predators while they're on the ground and can't fly, and just not very efficient. So the takeaway is warm your syrup on cold days. Don't leave it out overnight. And if you're up in the northeastern United States or someplace where it gets cold, you don't want to put even heavy syrups on top of your beehives for winter. It's just too cold for the bees. They're much better off having dry sugar, fondant, or sugar bricks and things like that, because it also gives them something to do with the moisture, the condensation that's going to build up inside the hive. They will use to metabolize the sugars or fondants or whatever you have on. The other thing is the foraging temperature. Based on this video and observations we made this year, the bees forage into the high 40s. So we've also shown that here, and that includes when they're foraging for pollen as well as nectar, but it's the nectar that has the toughest impact on the bees. Pollen, of course, they keep exterior, so they sweep that back onto their hind legs and fly back to the hive with it. It's not going to chill the bees in the same way that nectar would, or artificial nectar, which is really what we've shown here. Pro-sweet, full strength, good for the bees, but it should be warmed up first. So I hope you found this interesting and helpful in your own backyard beekeeping practices. If you're going to put syrup out and you warm it up, you improve everything for the bees. Thanks for watching.